Hi, everyone, and welcome to Smithsonian Social Studies Online. We are so excited to have you all with us here today. We are going to be spending the next half an hour here with you all. We'll be talking about the Smithsonian, some social studies content, as well as really focusing in on an important key question in the social studies field, which is, what is my community and how does it fit within the nation? So for the next half an hour, we'll just be talking about some of the resources that can help you explore this concept and this question. And we encourage you to ask us questions. And the way you can do that is by posting a comment. So my name is Abby. I'm an education specialist at the National Museum of American History, and I'll be responding to your questions through the comments. And I'll also be sharing your questions with our two hosts today, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I wanted to share a couple of guidelines before we do that. If you do post a comment, we encourage you and say that by posting a comment in the web chat, you agree that you will not post any personally identifiable information. And that if you're a parent or teacher watching with a young person, we strongly encourage you to watch and participate with them. Ask questions together. Think about what we're talking about together. Now, last thing, we'll be sharing a couple of resources throughout this half an hour. And we'll share a link at the very end where you can find everything we've talked about. And I'll also be sharing some of those links as we go through. So we hope you'll enjoy. Ask us lots of questions. And I'm going to turn it over to our guest host, starting with Orlando.
All right. Well, thank you, Abby. Before we get going and talk a little bit about, our community and our communities sort of tied together with the nation, I'd like to give our special guest today an opportunity to introduce herself and then I'll follow up and let you know who I am. Go, Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Moniz. I'm the David M. Rubenstein Curator of Philanthropy at the National Museum of American History.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amanda. And as Abby said, my name is Orlando Serrano, and I'm the manager for youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History, and appreciate you joining us today to talk a little bit about, the work that you do, Amanda, at our museum and how it relates to our theme and our question today.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. And we're going to talk a little bit about shifting landscapes and communities and how those two sort of come together in the work that you do. Before we get started, though, we do want to ask and see if there are any questions about our major theme today from folks who are out there. Any topics, any ideas that they'd like us to get to throughout our time together, we will do our best to do that. You can go ahead and put your questions there in the chat box, and Abby will let us know in case we miss them, what you're thinking about, what's on your mind. Okay, Amanda, you ready?
I am.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. All right, so you mentioned that you work in the philanthropy department, and before we start and get going with our first object here, can you let us know a little bit about, what that means? What is philanthropy, and how do you imagine that? What does that mean to you? And then a little bit about how your view of philanthropy informs your idea of community and ties to the nation.
Sure, I'll be happy to tackle those questions. So I'm the curator of the history of philanthropy, which means it's my job to collect objects to tell stories about how Americans have given throughout our history. A curator's role is to collect objects, work on exhibitions, share stories and objects digitally, and to conduct research. A lot of people ask what philanthropy means, because I think a lot of folks today, when they think of philanthropy, think of people who are major donors, major financial donors to institutions. That idea of philanthropy, of associating it with large financial gifts, comes from the late 19th century. I use the term more broadly. In the 1700s, the term philanthropy meant love of humanity, and it referred to a sentiment that could motivate action. It could motivate action for anti-slavery or prison reform or helping people with medical charities or lots of other ways. So I use it in that broad sense to mean giving time or money to help others or to promote social change.
Okay. So it's broader, if I'm hearing you correct, Amanda. It's broader than just giving money. It's more about giving generally to your neighbor. Is that accurate?
Correct. It could be giving to your neighbor, to
Okay.
your community, to different communities you belong to. The way I see it connecting to this question of community is that our philanthropy, our giving, comes from our senses of community. We all belong to one or more communities, our local community, our ethnic or religious community, the national community, and people give to those various different communities depending on the different circumstances of their lives or the period they're living in.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that. And I really appreciate your, the expansive understanding of community, that we are parts of many, not just one. My son has to do community service for his school, and we had to explain to him yesterday that right now, the most important community you have is the one that's in this house. But, also explaining that so is Washington, D.C. That's our larger community. All right. Well, can you tell us a little bit about this first object that we have here? What is it? Can you explain a little bit about what this is and why you chose it?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. This is a medal bestowed by the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. These humane societies had nothing to do with animals. The Humane Society movement began in the 1770s and 1780s to promote the rescue and resuscitation of drowning victims. In that period, a lot of Americans worked on the water or by the water, and drowning was an ever-present problem. Most people were not going to drown, but it was an ever-present reality in people's communities. Europeans started these charities. They spread across the Atlantic to North America, and Americans started establishing them in the 1780s. The way the charities worked was that they gave out these medals to people who had saved others from drowning. So why don't I stop there and see if you have any questions before I talk more about how this relates to community?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Do you remember what the inscription is on this particular object right here?
So this one was given to a man named Henry Austin Whitney in 1852, who had rescued his mother and niece from drowning. So this particular object comes from 1852, but the medal itself was designed. It was first created in the 1780s.
Oh, wow. Okay. And what are the different symbols here? There's lots of symbols. The iconography here is interesting. Yeah, I can see, as you mentioned, that it was, in 1791, it was the design. So what do the different emblems mean here, the symbols?
So if you take a close look, you'll see hands clasped, that showing working together, coming together to work collaboratively on a program to aid others. There's a picture of a ship going down in a storm. A lot of people, that was always a concern when people were on maritime journeys, particularly for commercial trade, that there could be storms and people could be at risk of drowning. And there's also at the top a picture of a hut, because sometimes shipwrecked mariners would. The Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts built huts for shipwrecked mariners to shelter in on the shore. To me, what's really significant here is that the images show that this problem of drowning was something that was experienced by maritime communities in different parts of the world. And so this was a problem that really connected Americans to various communities. And the charities pursued this program collaboratively with colleagues overseas. So it was part of their building bonds with other communities and thinking about moral responsibility in an expansive international way.
That's interesting. So you said this one was from Massachusetts, is that correct?
Yes, this medal was from the Humane Society of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. There were also humane societies in other American cities and other European and even in places in the Caribbean.
Actually, Amanda, let me pause you for a second. That's a really nice connection to a question that just came up that says, Amanda, do you know how global economic struggles such as recession impact philanthropy? And you're talking about international affairs. Could you help give some insight to that question?
Absolutely. Yes, for sure. These problems do affect people around the world, and philanthropists have in the past and today thought about them globally because we are interconnected. So a downturn in trade in one place can affect a community overseas. That's true with charities that Americans established in the early republic, in the early national period. They were very aware that the social problems they might be seeing in communities like New York could be shaped by situations elsewhere, leading to people traveling or working abroad. So I'd say these are really interconnected issues.
Thank you. That's great.
All right. Well, Amanda, let's go on to our next resource here. So what is this? What do we have here? Can you let us know a little bit about what this object is and where it comes from and how it might have been used?
Sure, absolutely. So this object is actually called a collar. I know it doesn't look like the kind of collar we usually think about. It is ceremonial clothing that would have been worn by members of fraternal organizations in the late 1800s. Fraternities were mutual aid organizations, brotherhoods and sisterhoods that provided mutual aid and helped foster community and cultural identity. Okay. And this would have been worn at ceremonial events such as parades or other special events.
Hey, Amanda, this is actually, you're hitting on these questions so well, and I'm sorry to interrupt. We've had another question in the chat that's a nice connection here. It says, how can we participate and enrich our local communities while we are participating in social distancing? And I think this speaks very well to that question.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me as I'm an early American historian by training is that even when now or in earlier eras, even when people were really dispersed, we could use whatever means of communication we have at our disposal. This was true long before the internet, to keep in touch with people elsewhere and to share the kind of things that we're doing locally. For instance, I've seen these rainbows of hope that people are putting up in their windows, sharing on social media as a way, a small way, but I think important in a stressful time, to support one another. That reminds me of earlier eras when people would share news, for instance, of the work that they were doing philanthropically with people in other communities, so to provide moral support and emotional support to their efforts.
Thank you, Amanda. And that actually reminds me, in the small moments of time that I'm able to go and take a walk outside, I've definitely seen the rainbows that you're talking about. And another great way that I've seen folks contributing or trying to provide some sort of uplift during this challenging time for the folks who are working. There are several must be young folks who have put together signs and hung them on their doors and windows saying thank you to the postal carriers, the letter carriers who are still working and bringing, the different folks, the different materials they were ordering online to their homes. So another, the internet is great, technology is great, but we have these old school ways of definitely contributing to our communities. Thank you, Amanda.
Absolutely.
I do have one more question about this object. Would one wear this as a scarf? Is that how it was used?
No, it was not worn as a scarf. It was really a ceremonial regalia that you would put on, the way you could think of the way priests put on special garments, or in a synagogue you put on special garments. Sort of you drape around you. It's not a scarf for warmth.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that makes sense. I see the little clasp right here at the bottom where you would join it together there in the front to make sure it doesn't fall off. Right. All right. Especially if you're in a parade and it's getting a little bit rowdy, it stays there. All right. Well, let's pause here, see if we have any more questions. Amanda, how long have you been working at American History, and what got you interested in the field of philanthropy?
I've been working here for about 3.5 years. I got interested because I've always been interested in these questions about community, how people define community, and how they participate in various communities. And I'm interested in how we set and debate priorities for our community, who has voices for that, whose voices are heard, how we bring our voices to these questions. I also think philanthropy is a way to look at questions like inequality, and these are very important issues at this time as in past eras.
Okay, well, it's very interesting to hear you describe how you got interested in the field and the ways that you're interested in whose voices get to be heard, and how do we understand and get at past and current inequities, especially given our next object. What is this? Can you tell us a little bit about what we have here?
Absolutely. This is a poster, a fundraising poster for something called the Crispus Attucks Circle for War Relief, which was a Philadelphia organization that raised money to establish a new hospital in Philadelphia in the World War I era around 1918. The hospital opened in 1919 to aid African-American members of the military who were not being treated equally. They were not getting equal access to medical care.
Interesting. So who was involved with the fundraising now, and I want to ask a clarifying question. So the Crispus Attucks Circle, is that the organization that was raising funds for the hospital?
Yes, the hospital is called Mercy Hospital, and this the Crispus Attucks Circle for War Relief was an organization raising money, as were other individuals and organizations. Okay,
and so who would get involved in these kinds of organizations?
This was an African-American effort, and there were also white supporters who were contributing to the hospital too.
Okay. Now, if I recall correctly, our previous object, the collar, was that were the folks who made that, were they based in Philadelphia?
Yes, Philadelphia. Also a Philadelphia African-American couple. The collar was made by a woman named Lizzie Bowser.
Oh, is there any way of knowing if any folks related with Miss Bowser were involved with something like the Crispus Attucks Circle?
I wondered that question too. I have not been able to find a direct link. Lizzie Bowser and her husband, David Bussell Bowser, were active in the mid and late 1800s, but it's not impossible that there would have been connections. I just haven't found those details.
That's great. And so the line here at the bottom is very interesting to me. It says German shells draw no color line. Can you explain that a little bit for us?
Right. So this poster is making the point that the weapons used by the Germans against Americans in World War I didn't distinguish between African Americans and other Americans. And so it's making the point that African Americans should be treated equally. It's demanding full inclusion and equality.
So to make sure I understand, we have this African American community in Philadelphia sort of appealing or making a claim to folks in their immediate area, hey, we are an important part in contributing to this nation through this war effort, and we need some help. Is that accurate?
Yes, and using the name Crispus Attucks also made that point. Crispus Attucks was a victim of the Boston Massacre during the American Revolution, and so invoking his name invoked African Americans' long participation in American military, in American wars, and sacrifices for the nation. So it's making the point African Americans have been a part of this community and nation and deserve to be treated equally.
That's very interesting. Yeah, that's a great tie to a previous event in U.S. history. All right, let's see.
All right, hold on. Actually, let's pause for a second. We've got a really great question in the chat. It says, "Hi, Amanda. How do you find objects to put in the museum?" And I love when we get questions about collecting and how museums work. Amanda, I know we'd all love to hear your take on this.
Sure, absolutely. There are a number of different ways. So if we go back to the collar made by Lizzie Bowser, that was purchased at auction. That's one way the museum acquires things. Most objects, however, are donated. About 3/4 of the objects in our holdings are donated, sometimes curators like myself approach individuals or organizations that we're studying and we're interested in and ask if there are objects that we might collect to tell that person or organizations or businesses or what have you's story. Sometimes we're approached by potential object donors that they have something in their attic that belongs to their family that tells a really compelling story, and then we evaluate whether it would fit within the scope of our collection. So those are a couple different ways we acquire things.
Nice. And there's limited exhibition space at the museum, and so I'd like to actually ask a follow-up question. How do you decide what goes on display and what stays in storage?
Well, we always want to make our objects available to the public. So exhibitions, physical exhibitions in the museum is one way, but online sources like this is another way. We try to make things as widely accessible as possible. And in fact, our records are increasingly available in really rich ways. In terms of deciding what goes on view in a physical exhibition, there are a few things. Space is a consideration. How much space is there for an exhibition, and what will fit within that space? Fragility of the objects is another consideration. So a textile object like this bowl of rice party banner can only be out for a few months. So we might put it on view for a few months and then have to take it off and not be able to put it on view for a couple more years or longer, depending on what the object is. Then we also think about how objects will fit with other objects that are being put on view. How are they put in conversation with one another, and what's the story that they tell?
Thank you.
Yeah, and Amanda, I want to know the story behind this object. This is really intense. We've got a young person here who seems to be quite upset, very emotive in his face, and he's looks like holding an empty bowl. And we got the language there. It says bowl of rice, and we've got a date, 1940, SF Chinatown. I'm gonna go ahead and guess at San Francisco Chinatown. What's going on with this young man? How can we help him out?
Right, I know. I find this an incredibly visually compelling object. This is a banner that was used in fundraising efforts to help Chinese people who were suffering in the Second Sino-Japanese War in the late 30s and early 40s. So this is depicting a boy who's in great distress as a way to encourage donations. As you folks probably know, images of victims in distress are often used in fundraising efforts. So that's what's going on in this picture.
And can you mentioned the Second Sino-Japanese War. What does Sino mean in this context?
Sino means it refers to China. So this was a war between China and Japan, and there was a lot of humanitarian suffering in China. Okay.
Now, this particular one is for San Francisco. Were the folks in San Francisco collecting aid to send to China?
Yes, that's right. So Chinese Americans in San Francisco and New York's Chinatowns led efforts to raise humanitarian funds for relief in China. But these efforts were called Bowl of Rice Parties, these fundraising efforts, and they spread to communities across the country, not just Chinese American, but many communities participated in these efforts. Okay.
And it seems like this is doing a lot of the similar work that the coin was doing earlier, the Humane Society coin, where there's connections being made and forged, across countries. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yes. I think this object, like the Humane Society medal, show us how Americans imagine their communities, how they think about their communities, and think about belonging to multiple communities, think in expansive ways about community through philanthropy.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to the idea of, that you mentioned early on and how you got interested in this, or how you think about philanthropy, and that humane used to mean not just, helping out our animal friends, but helping out our people friends, right? That this is all about helping in a larger global sense of what it means to, care for others and our neighbors. That's really interesting.
Absolutely, but I think it's important to note that we don't all agree on what helping means. We have different senses of how to help people in need, whether to help people in need, what our priorities are for social change. And so philanthropy is often contested. It's a way to set and debate priorities for our communities. We don't all have the same understanding of what the common good is.
Interesting. Okay. Well, let's see. We have time for, I believe, one more object. Oh, and we've got a picture of a man here. What do we have here? Can you tell us a little bit about Pedro Llosa's story?
Absolutely. So Pedro Llosa was a Mexican immigrant to Chicago, a working class man whose story I wanted to tell because he was involved with raising money for his hometown church in Mexico. He and his family would organize fundraising dances on a weekly basis to raise money for their church from the community they came from in Mexico. The church was adobe and it was falling apart. So over several years, he coordinated these dances and raised money to build a new church. I really love the story because it shows, it's a very typical story for immigrants to the United States and for longstanding U.S. Citizens and residents to remain connected to communities they hailed from, that they came from. So it's another example of how Americans belong to multiple communities and express that through their philanthropy.
Excellent. And where did Pedro host these dance parties? Where did he? What immediate community did he live in to draw folks to these parties?
He was in Chicago.
Okay. All right.
I love the idea of virtual dance parties these days, just as an inspiration from Mr. Llosa.
Right.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, Amanda, we're getting close to the end of our time together here. I have a question,
Sure.
as we're waiting for other people. I'm really interested in, when we were talking about the banner and what it means to care and give for our communities, how are you, one of our guests earlier asked a question about how a recession might impact philanthropy. I'm interested, how are you keeping track of the current, difficult situation that we're in with the coronavirus? And are you tracking and are you monitoring how people are talking about, the common good, as you put it right now?
Absolutely. I've been keeping track of those conversations on Twitter and social media and in news and things I'm personally hearing. I think collecting around the philanthropic response to this situation will be important. And it'll be a story that unfolds now in the immediate moment, but also over time, because the strains are going to last for a long time. And there'll be a big impact on nonprofit organizations for a while. At the museum, we are thinking in a coordinated way about these issues. So I don't have any immediate plans, but it's something very much on the top of my mind these days, that this is something I will be paying a lot of attention to.
And you did a great job earlier of letting us know some, analog ways that folks are contributing in their community. Is there an effort that you have, that you've come across in social media that has, piqued your interest? Like, I'd like to know about this a little bit more later on once we're able to get out and do some research.
There are a lot. One of the things that struck me is that some of what we're seeing reminds me of Americans' experiences during other crises. There are people who are sewing masks for medical workers and contributing those. That reminds me of the kind of contributions women in particular made in the Civil War and World War I to sew materials for soldiers, for people in hospitals. So it's really striking in some ways that we see a persistence of Americans helping in weight, but it's striking to me that some of these are things that I thought were from earlier eras. Okay.
So it's sort of a through line, it's a recall.
That's a good way of putting it. I haven't really had time to unpack and analyze it, but I think that's a great way of putting it.
Okay, and I do want to call attention to a couple of websites that we did not get to, a couple of resources we didn't have a chance to get to today. Can you say a little bit about Giving in Health and Who Pays for Education?
Absolutely. So the museum has a long-term exhibition, Giving in America. It's up in the museum. So if you visit the museum, you can come see it. And we also have an online version. And so these are two of the special sections that we featured in the online version of the exhibit and in the physical exhibit. Giving in Health explores how Americans' medical philanthropy connects them to communities around the world, the way medical developments here in the US and abroad affect one another. And the other one, Who Pays for Education, is the newest section of the exhibition, and it explores debates about funding education in local and the national community over time.
Wonderful. Now, we are getting close to the end of our time.
Yep, we're actually out of time.
Yeah. So here's the website for our Learning Lab collection. If you copy and paste it into your browser, you will lab collection that has all the resources that Amanda shared with us today. So Amanda, thank you for your time. We very much appreciate the work that you're doing and for being with us today and answering some of our questions.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Yep. And for everyone else, we are so appreciative that you came and joined us for this half an hour. Great questions. We're here every Thursday at 11 a.m. with all sorts of different social studies types questions. I just posted the link to the Smithsonian's distance learning page in the chat box. And if you go to that page, it's learninglab.si.edu/distance learning. You can find a calendar of all of the Smithsonian social studies online sessions, as well as distance learning from across the Smithsonian, different subject areas, and just an amazing amount of information on K-12 resources and Smithsonian information generally. So we hope you'll check it out, and we are looking forward to seeing you in the future. And come back and visit this video anytime you want. It will be archived and available at this exact same YouTube link that you're watching right now. So we hope you all stay safe and well. Have a great day. And again, thanks for being here. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.